All right, so while the country reels from the surge of cases of coronavirus, President Trump has turned his focus to defending monuments and railing against protesters. Is this the right strategy for him for 2020? Joining us now, David Frum, staff writer at The Atlantic, a former speechwriter for President George W. Bush. David, I can hear you. Hopefully you can hear us right now. We've talked a lot over the course of the show, and people have heard over the weekend about why the president is so intent on making statues an issue. I think a more interesting discussion is, will it work? And you make a compelling case that you don't think it will. Why?
In 2016, when Donald Trump ran for president the first time, he talked about things that people cared about. He talked about drugs. He talked about trade. He talked about immigration. Now, maybe what he said was poorly considered. Maybe he didn't have real solutions, but he found real issues that were neglected by others. And at a time when the economy was growing and the country was generally in good shape, his issues resonated. So now we're in the middle of this terrible pandemic, more than 100,000 Americans dead, worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. And the president is not talking about that. He's talking about what he and his ideological bubble care about: statues, statues, statues.
David, you know, we had David Gregory on earlier, and he brought up something that I heard as well in the president's speech. And it was the word that stuck out to me because my brain is also tuned to Fox speak. And the second I heard it, I recognized it from all of the other, talking points that Fox relies on and that we've heard from the president in the past, and that was indoctrinate. And so it's beyond statues. Yeah. It's, we're not going to let the left indoctrinate our children about political correctness and erasing our history. Do you think that that resonates at all right now?
I invite you to consider this election not from the point of view of someone who watches a lot of cable TV, Fox, or any other network, but from the point of view of the person who's going to decide this election. A 50-something woman without a college degree living in one of half a dozen swing states, and probably someone in her family has lost a job. Maybe she's lost her job. The budget is very, very tight. And of course, they're terrified of getting sick. Now, how does that woman respond when she hears the president talk about leftist indoctrination? She thinks, what's he talking about? The one thing she knows is he's not talking about or to me. With Donald Trump, people often think because he got so lucky in 2016 that he's got some master plan. But in fact, he's just got his own instincts for aggression. And by a lucky fluke, they paid off for him in 2016. They didn't pay off in 2018. And he can't figure out in 2020 how to talk to a country that is terrified of disease and is hard-pressed economically.
You use a great Haley Barbour quote, which, of course, is to keep the main thing. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. What's the main thing here, Dave?
Right. Haley Barbour was chairman of the RNC in the 1980s, the Republican National Committee, and maybe the most successful holder of that job ever. And he always was cautioning conservative candidates in those days. You have lots of issues you care about and that our base cares about. Remember who's deciding this election. And for that person, typically a woman, the main thing is what she cares about most. Keep that main thing the main thing. And your main thing is never to forget it.
The other thing about President Trump's speech this weekend was that the words were so obviously not his. I mean, he uses words during these grand speeches that are so incongruous from what we normally hear him say. He was saying things like the untamed spirit of America, the unrelenting optimism. This isn't how he talks at his rallies. I mean, David, I don't know if you're a body language expert, but I am. And even his body language at the 4th of July rally, he was leaning on the podium. He was sort of uncomfortable. He was clearly working the teleprompter pretty hard. And so it's just hard to know if those speeches resonate in the way that his rallies do.
The Washington Post over the weekend had a story about how many of the people in the Trump communication shop get there because they're related to somebody else. It's a very nepotistic organization. And the problem with nepotism is it's not a good way to find talent. These are not talented people. And they're people who come from a very narrow political world. And so they don't ask an obvious question like, okay, suppose disorder in the streets and the tearing down of statues or the lawful removal of statues, and that's not the same thing as vandalism. Suppose that is the most important issue in America. Suppose you believe that. Who's president right now while all of that is happening? Who is the president who's failing to act? Why? It's our guy. You can't run against the status quo when you are the president of the status quo.
Yeah, historians will note that he may be trying to run the 1968 Richard Nixon campaign. The problem is he's running as Richard Nixon, but he is LBJ. I mean, there's a little bit of a problem there.
He is LBJ. He is the. It's all. This is all happening on his watch. He has no one else to blame, or he can try, but it won't be very convincing outside the very narrow anti-reality community in which he spends his days absorbing TV junk.
David Frum, always great to talk to you. Thank you very much.